All right, welcome to Watercolor Approaches. So I'm going to do this worksheet. I have my own handmade one right here, but I'll print out a nice one for you. This is where you're going to learn how to work with watercolors, and there's a few things you should know. First of all, I have a set of watercolors right here. And you see all these little droplets of water. This is because I sprayed my palette down so that I can activate my colors, and that way I'm not dripping colors from a wet paintbrush into this and making a whole nasty little pool. Spraying it is a nice way of activating the color and getting it to moisten. So that's tip number one. Some other things that you have to pay attention to. Because when you're working with watercolors, it's all about control. So depending on what kind of control you want, there's some different things to think about. And one of the things you need to think about is your brushes. So typically with watercolors, I like to use round brushes. The ferrule right here is nice and round, and then this comes to a nice round tip over here. You can feel it just feels round, versus like a flat paintbrush where you actually feel this part and it's flat and the top looks like a rectangle. Okay, so these are all round brushes. And then another thing you want to look at is like the snap of the brush. So there's a lot of resistance in those hairs of the brush. That means you're going to be able to control paint really well and do nice fine details. Bigger brushes like this that don't have, they're a little more floppy. They don't have as much snap to them. These are really good for filling in areas with color. So that's something to also think about. The other thing that you're going to learn as you're going through this is how to control the wetness and the dryness of the paper, as well as how to when to let the watercolors sort of set and dry. Watercolors is a very additive and subtractive medium, so you can add more and more, and you can also pull away, which is kind of cool. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is just show you how to do wet on dry. So I'm going to take a slightly moistened brush here, and I've activated my colors, and I'm just going to fill in this area right here, just so you can feel what it's like just to take some watercolors and paint them on a dry paper. Okay, it's easy to control. The paint allows me to move it where I want it to go, and that's just wet on dry. Forgot to mention my little worksheet. It's not the best paper I'm doing this on. Typically you want to paint on nice, good 100% or cottony paper that's nice and thick. But for this, we're just going to use regular paper, just out of my sketchbook, and I've taped it down because we're using water and watercolors. It makes the paper warp. So taping it down with whatever paper you're using is a good idea, so that it keeps the paper a little bit more flat and doesn't curve up. Okay, so this was wet on dry, which is simple enough. Okay, nice, easy. I was able to control the paint. This next one, I'm going to take some clean water, not too much. I'm not trying to drown my paper, and just wet the paper, because now we're going to take wet paint and paint into this wet surface, and you'll instantly feel a difference. See how the paint kind of blooms and blossoms on its own, which is kind of fun. That's a lot of the fun of watercolor, but it's definitely harder to control. As soon as I lift up my paintbrush, it starts moving on its own. It starts to move to other areas where it's wet. It's kind of like it wants to create equilibrium and diffuse. I think it's diffusion. Okay, this is really fun. So I'm going to wet the surface again, okay, and I'm going to drop little splotches of color in, and just watch them sort of bloom and grow. I'll do another color. There we go. Okay, so that can be really, really fun. All right, now next thing is a dry brush. So my brush isn't, even though it's dry brush, it's not going to be totally dry. So I'm taking another brush right here, and yes, it was sitting in some water, so I will squeeze most of that water out just like that, so it's mostly dry. And then I'm not going to add any more water to my watercolors over here, but I'm just going to dip my tips of my brush in. And what's cool about dry brushing is you can create really cool texture, like that. Makes really, really scratchy texture. Okay, I'll do it with a bit of a finer brush as well. You can also make kind of stronger lines with a drier brush. Okay. But the texture thing is really, really cool, I think. All right, now we're going to get into having more control of the wetness and dryness of the paper. I'm going to fill this box with 2 different colors in it, and I want to create a nice definition. Like I'm going to do one triangle here. I'm just going to go with brown. Okay. There we go. Okay, and then I want to paint another color here, but I want to keep intact that nice crisp line edge I have right there. So I'm going to move on over to something else and let that dry before I go to paint something, before I go to paint the next color. That way I have more control. If I want to do a softer edge, 2 colors, I could totally do that. Okay, I'm filling in with some red. Okay, and then we'll go with some blue. Okay. And that's all good and nice. And if I had already wet my paper, they'd already be mixing together. But I could take a nice clean wet brush again and kind of blend them together now. That way create a little bit of a soft edge. Okay. For blotting, I'm going to wet my paper a little bit, just gently. I don't need to drown it. Okay. And I'll go with green this time. Okay, now if I want to blot this while it's still wet, that's possible. So I'll take a nice dry little piece of paper towel and I can blot it. There we go. And I could subtract from what I put down. And then I'm going to come back to this and show you how I could still blotted it later on if I want to. Okay, masking means, what's cool is that this is watercolor, and if I want to keep an area, without watercolor, then I can use something to kind of block out a certain area. I can mask it away. So I'm going to use an oil pastel, which makes sense because this has oil in it and it will reject the water. You can also use a white crayon. I believe there's something called masking fluid that allows you to do this. You can even use masking or like a painter's tape. But okay, so I've written my little message. Okay, and there you go. See, it resisted the watercolor. Okay, just fun. That's a lot of fun. Okay, now watercolors dry pretty quickly. As long as it doesn't still look shiny, it should be good to go. So I'm going to add another color to that hard edge that I said I would do. And because I allowed that first edge to dry, then I can come in and paint with my next color. And they won't blend because I took control of just letting the color dry first, okay? So there's a lot of things to keep in mind while you're doing this, okay? So, oh, this is still not ready yet, so I'm just going to leave that there. In terms of a value scale, this is simple enough to do. This is very much like doing this with pencil. I'll choose green, okay? And the lighter you want a color to be, it's very simple. The more water you're going to add to it. I'm just going to add the slightest bit of water over my value scale, just because it helps. I like doing that because it helps helps me spread the paint out a little bit more easily. Okay, so just slightly moistened. And this first value right here, I'm just going to leave it white for now. But this next one, if I want a really, really, really light value of green, that means I have to add water to it. So I'm just going to use this little area right here to get some green and add a little clean water in there. And let's see how I did. Okay, very good. We have a very nice light bit of green. Okay, and then now I can add a little bit more of my paint. Okay, hopefully I didn't get too far. Okay, that's good. So just the more paint that you use, then the darker it'll be. Okay, and if I didn't like this, if I didn't think it was dark enough, I could always just let it dry and add another layer to it. That's one of the good things about watercolors, which we'll learn about more. Okay, adding a little bit more paint in that area, just working it into my brush. There we go. I could do better than that. Okay. And for this last one, because I want to show more of a darker value of green, then I'll go right into my little palette. There we go. Get a nice coating of green. And so I said this wasn't exactly watercolor paper, and it is crinkling. It's not the best paper. And what happens is it creates little pools because it crinkles. So yeah, gotta be careful with that. I'm gonna try blotting this now. Before I blotted it with a dry paper towel over here, but now that it's dry, I need to get something wet to blot away at this. Okay, so you see, I can go back and subtract away from what I did before. Okay, I'm going to try and do, before my time runs out, a graded wash, which just means like a nice little gradient. So I'm going to put some water down because it's much easier to do when the paper is wet, and get a little bit of my paint, and just going to work from darkest to lightest. My tip of my brush had a lot more paint on it, and then as I moved away, it ran out of paint, and that naturally created a little gradient. I'll put a little bit more so you can see a little better. There we go. And as I move side to side down, okay, it creates a nice little gradient. I could do the same thing here. Instead, I could do two colors. There's a lot of water on that. Okay. That way. And then clean off my brush. And I can bring it in the other way. And they start to blend together. I'll put down a little bit too much water on that part, but that's okay. And the last thing here, paint a sphere. So again, I like to add water first to what I'm doing, and I like to work a little bit more dark to light. And just let the water kind of do some of the work for me. I just have about a minute left. Hopefully I get through this. There we go. See? Put down a little bit of water. It just kind of does the work for you. Okay. Good news is if I accidentally put down too much, I can always subtract with just a paper towel by wetting it. There we go. And you're really starting to see it kind of come together. Okay. And the clean brush, I can kind of, clean, slightly wet brush, I can kind of come in and smooth some of this stuff out. We're about to run out of time. And I'm just going to finish this on my own, but that's it. Watercolor Approaches. Hope you liked it. Have fun.